Nefarani sat within the grand palace, surrounded by walls adorned with gold, rare gems, and the finest silks. Yet, despite the beauty and luxury that surrounded her, an emptiness gnawed at her soul. Her marriage to Pharaoh Setep-Ka, the ruler of the land, had not brought the joy or companionship she had once imagined. He was a man of power and ambition, one who saw her not as a wife but as a symbol of his dominion. She was a queen, revered and adorned. Yet she felt like a caged bird trapped in a world where her voice held no meaning, her heart left to wither in silence. Standing on her balcony, Nefarani gazed upon the vast palace grounds, where slaves toiled under the relentless heat of the sun. Some carried heavy stones for the great monuments. Others scrubbed the palace floors, their bodies bent from exhaustion. Her eyes drifted across the scene, uninterested, until they landed upon one figure among them. He was unlike the others, not merely because of his strong build or the way his dark hair curled at the nape of his neck, but because there was something different in the way he carried himself. There was no defeat in his posture, no broken spirit in his movements. As if sensing her gaze, the slave lifted his head, and for a fleeting moment, their eyes met. Nefarani's breath caught in her throat. His eyes, deep and rich like the earth after rain, held a quiet strength, an intensity that sent a shiver through her. It was only a second, barely even that, but in that moment, something shifted inside her. Her heart, which had remained cold for so long, stirred with something unfamiliar. The slave quickly lowered his gaze, as if realizing the danger of what had just transpired. Yet, the moment had already left its mark on them both. Nefarani turned away from the balcony, but her thoughts remained fixated on the brief exchange. It was foolish to dwell on it, dangerous even, but she could not shake the image of his eyes, the way they had looked at her, not with fear, not with blind admiration like those in the court, but with something else, something real. She knew she could not afford such thoughts. Yet the more she told herself to forget, the more her heart refused to obey. She had lived in a world of cold duty for so long, could it be that she was craving something more? As the day faded into evening, Nefarani found herself walking through the palace halls in a daze. Her mind should have been preoccupied with matters of state, with the expectations placed upon her as queen. Yet all she could see was the face of the slave. She did not know his name, nor did she know his story, but something inside her longed to. The mere thought was madness, dangerous madness, but deep within her heart, a seed had been planted, one that, if left unchecked, would grow into something forbidden, something unstoppable. And for the first time in her life, she did not wish to stop it. Nefarani sat upon the marble throne beside Pharaoh Setep-Ka, adorned in gold and precious jewels, yet she felt utterly invisible. Her husband, the ruler of Egypt, was a man of war and conquest, his heart consumed by power and the pursuit of immortality. In their marriage, there was no love, no tenderness, only duty. She had been chosen for her beauty, for the noble blood in her veins, but never for who she truly was. Every day, she played the role expected of her, a silent queen beside a god-king who barely acknowledged her existence. The palace was vast, filled with servants and nobles who bowed at her feet, yet she had never felt more alone. The courtiers whispered of her beauty, of her grace, but none dared to see past the golden mask she was forced to wear. The nights were the worst, long and empty, as she lay in a bed meant for two, yet claimed by only one. The pharaoh visited her chamber only when duty called for it, never for love, never for warmth. And so, she drifted through her days like a shadow in her own life, yearning for something she could not name. Kailen wiped the sweat from his brow as he lifted another heavy stone, his muscles burning with exhaustion. The sun was relentless, beating down upon the workers as they labored under the watchful eyes of the overseers. To be a slave in Egypt was to be less than human, to exist only to serve, to build, to suffer. But Kailen had always been different. Though his body bore the same scars as the others, his spirit refused to break. He had been born into this life, yet he had never accepted it. Where others bowed in submission, he held his head high. He was careful. Of course, defiance meant death, but within him burned a quiet fire, a belief that he was more than the chains that bound him. At night, when the other slaves collapsed in exhaustion, he would look up at the stars and wonder if the gods had more in store for him. He had long since abandoned hope of freedom, yet something within him whispered that his fate was not meant to end in the sands of Egypt. He did not know that soon his path would cross with that of a queen, and his life would never be the same again. From her balcony, Nefarani found herself watching the slave again. She had told herself it was nothing, a passing curiosity. But the more she observed him, the more she realized there was something different about him. Unlike the others, he did not move like a broken man. He carried himself with strength, with dignity, despite the weight upon his back. One afternoon, as she walked through the palace gardens, she saw him kneeling by a small, injured dove. The tiny creature trembled in his rough, calloused hands, its wing bent at an odd angle. Instead of ignoring it, as most would, he gently stroked its feathers, whispering soothing words as he carefully wrapped its wing with a scrap of cloth. Nefarani's breath caught in her throat. A slave with kindness, with compassion. She had never seen such a thing before. In that moment, she knew she had to know more. This was no ordinary laborer. There was something inside him, something rare. But what was it that drew her so? Was it his strength, his kindness? Or was it that in his eyes she saw the freedom she had always longed for? Unable to quiet the thoughts in her mind, Nefarani summoned her handmaiden, Merit, a woman she had trusted since childhood. If there was anyone who could discreetly learn more about the slave, it was her. Merit hesitated when Nefarani made her request, concern flickering in her dark eyes. "My queen, this is dangerous," she warned. "You should not concern yourself with a slave. If the pharaoh or the vizier were to suspect anything..." But Nefarani would not be deterred. She dismissed Merit's fears, insisting that it was simple curiosity. Reluctantly, Merit agreed to inquire about him. The next day, she returned with his name Kailen, a laborer who had been in servitude for years. He was known for his strength, but also for his sharp mind and unusual resilience. Some of the overseers resented him for his quiet defiance, but they kept him alive because he was too valuable to lose. The more Nefarani learned, the more she wanted to know. Yet even as she felt herself drawn further into this fascination, she ignored the warning in Merit's eyes. This was not mere curiosity. It was something far more dangerous. Unbeknownst to Nefarani, she was not the only one who had taken notice of her growing interest in the slave. Vizier Rahotep, the pharaoh's most trusted advisor, was a man who missed nothing. He had served the royal court for decades, his mind sharp, his loyalty unquestionable. He knew the dangers that lurked in the shadows, the whispers that could topple even the most powerful of rulers. And now, he saw something troubling in the queen's gaze. She had always been dutiful, distant, a woman of grace and restraint. Yet lately, there was something different about her. The way her eyes lingered too long on the workers below. The way she dismissed courtiers with distracted nods, lost in thoughts she would not share. Rahotep did not yet know what she was hiding, but he intended to find out. A queen should not concern herself with matters beneath her station. If she was keeping secrets, he would uncover them. And if those secrets threatened the sanctity of Pharaoh's rule, then he would do what must be done. After all, love was a weakness, and weakness had no place in the palace of a god. Nefarani knew she was playing a dangerous game, but the pull toward Kailen was stronger than reason. One night, cloaked in a simple linen robe, she ventured out of the palace under the cover of darkness, her heart pounding in her chest. Merit had arranged everything. Kailen had been summoned to a secluded section of the garden, unaware of who awaited him. When he arrived, his eyes widened in shock at the sight of the queen standing before him. He immediately fell to his knees, pressing his forehead to the ground. "My queen," he whispered, his voice laced with both reverence and fear. Nefarani swallowed hard. "Rise, Kailen," she said softly. Though even she did not fully understand why she had come. He hesitated before obeying, his gaze never meeting hers. "Do you know who I am?" she asked. "Of course," he replied. "You are the Queen of Egypt, wife of Pharaoh, daughter of the gods." His words should have reminded her of the impossibility of what she was doing. Yet instead, they only made her chest tighten with frustration. "And yet, I am more than that," she murmured half to herself. Kailen stiffened, sensing the danger of her words. He knew that whatever this was, it could end only in ruin. Despite the risk, the meetings continued. At first, Nefarani told herself she was only seeking conversation, an escape from the suffocating isolation of her palace life. But as the nights passed, she knew it was more than that. Kailen spoke to her not as a queen, but as a person, and with each stolen moment, the invisible chains that bound her to her royal life loosened. She learned of his past, how he had been born a free man, only to be enslaved after his father's rebellion failed. He spoke not with bitterness, but with quiet acceptance, as though he had long since made peace with his fate. And yet, she saw something in him that defied the destiny forced upon him. "You do not speak like a slave," she once told him. "Because I do not think like one," he answered simply. His words stirred something deep within her. She had spent years believing that she had no choice but to live the life given to her. But Kailen, though bound in chains, still believed in choice. And for the first time in her life, Nefarani wondered if she, too, had a choice to follow the path set for her, or to forge a new one. Under the moonlight, Kailen painted a world Nefarani had never known. He told her of the villages beyond the palace walls, of the people who worked the land, who lived and died under Pharaoh's rule without ever stepping foot inside the grand city. He told her of laughter and music, of mothers who rocked their children to sleep, of men who loved freely without the weight of duty on their shoulders. Nefarani listened with wide eyes, realizing how little she knew of the world beyond her golden cage. "They are free," she murmured. "But they are not queens," Kailen reminded her. "And neither am I, not truly." His words haunted her long after she left him that night. She had always believed that power and wealth equated to freedom, But Kailen's stories made her question everything. She had never tasted true joy, never known love untainted by expectation. For all the gold that adorned her, was she any different from the slaves who labored in the scorching sun? She had never questioned her place before, but now she could not stop. And deep down, she knew it was because of him. He was changing her, or perhaps he was revealing a part of her that had always been there. One evening, as Nefarani made her way to the hidden garden where Kailen waited, she heard rustling in the grass. Before she could react, a low hiss sent a shiver down her spine, a deadly asp, its black eyes gleaming under the moonlight. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. One bite, and her life would end in mere moments. Before she could scream, Kailen sprang into action. With swift precision, he snatched a nearby staff and struck the snake before it could lunge at her. The serpent twisted and writhed before falling still. Nefarani's body trembled as she stared at it, realizing just how close she had come to death. Kailen knelt beside her, his hands gripping her shoulders, his face filled with concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You saved me." Their eyes met, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Gratitude, relief, and something else, something far more dangerous. Her heart pounded, but this time, it was not from fear. Without thinking, she reached for his hand, and for the first time, he did not pull away. The line between queen and slave blurred, and Nefarani knew there was no turning back. Merit was waiting for Nefarani when she returned to her chambers that night, her face pale with worry. "My queen, I beg you, stop this before it is too late," she pleaded. Nefarani turned away, but Merit would not be silenced. "If the pharaoh learns of this, if the vizier suspects anything, you will not be spared, and neither will he." Nefarani's hands clenched at her sides. She knew Merit was right. If she continued down this path, it would end in ruin. But how could she stop now? How could she ignore what her heart had already decided? "I cannot," she whispered, and the confession felt like a weight lifting off her chest. Merit's eyes filled with sorrow. "Then you will lose everything." The words should have frightened Nefarani, but they did not. Because when she thought of everything, she realized that her life without Kailen was already empty. She had spent years living in a gilded prison, and for the first time, she had tasted what it felt like to be free, even if it was only in the presence of one man, even if it was fleeting, even if it would destroy her. She would not turn away now, not from him, not from this. Rahotep had been watching for weeks, his suspicions growing with every stolen glance, every unexplained absence of the queen. He had seen the way her eyes lingered on the slave, the way her steps became hurried as she slipped away in the night. A queen's curiosity about a slave was unnatural, dangerous, and so he devised a trap. One evening, he arranged for the palace guards to patrol the hidden garden, ensuring that should Nefarani and Kailen meet, they would be caught. The moment arrived swiftly. Nefarani had just reached Kailen, their hands barely touching, when torches flared all around them, illuminating the betrayal. "Seize him!" the captain of the guards roared. Kailen moved instinctively, pushing Nefarani behind him, but there was nowhere to run. The guards swarmed, striking him down with the butts of their spears, forcing him to his knees. Nefarani screamed, trying to reach him, but rough hands grabbed her, dragging her away. "No, leave him!" she cried, but her pleas went unheard. As she was pulled back into the palace, her heart pounded with terror. This was no longer a secret affair. It was treason. And there was only one punishment for treason against Pharaoh. Setep-Ka stood before Nefarani in the throne room, his face carved from stone, his eyes burning with fury. The court was silent, the air heavy with unspoken judgment. "Is it true?" His voice was cold, lethal. Nefarani, kneeling before him, lifted her chin, refusing to cower. "Yes," she said, her voice unwavering. Gasps echoed through the hall. The pharaoh's hands clenched into fists. "You shame me, Nefarani. You shame the gods." She had seen him angry before, but never like this. His pride had been wounded, his rule challenged by her betrayal. "The slave will die at sunrise," he declared. "And you, my queen, will live long enough to remember your disgrace." Nefarani's breath left her in a strangled gasp. "No, you cannot." She surged forward, but guards held her back. "Kill me instead," she begged. "Spare him, and I will do whatever you command." But Setep-Ka only looked at her with disgust. "You are nothing to me now." His judgment had been passed. Kailen's fate was sealed, and there was nothing she could do. Kailen lay in the darkness of the prison cell, his body battered, his spirit unbroken. They had beaten him, demanded a confession, asked if the queen had bewitched him. He had answered only with silence. Love was not a crime he would apologize for. When the door creaked open, he expected another blow, but instead he saw her Nefarani, her face streaked with tears. "I will get you out," she whispered, gripping the iron bars. Kailen's heart clenched at the sight of her, so beautiful even in despair. "No," he said gently. "You must save yourself." But Nefarani shook her head violently. "I cannot live knowing you die because of me." He reached through the bars, cupping her cheek. "Then remember me," he murmured. "Remember that I loved you, even when the gods forbade it." Nefarani pressed her lips to his fingers, her heart breaking. She had been powerless for so long, a pawn in a world ruled by men. But for him, she would find the strength to fight. That night, Nefarani went to the pharaoh one last time. She knelt before him, lowering her head in a way she never had before. "My king," she said softly, "spare him, and I will do whatever you ask. I will exile myself. I will leave Egypt forever, but do not kill him." Setep-Ka stared down at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he laughed a hollow, bitter sound. "You beg for a slave's life as if it is worth more than your own," he mused. "Is this the depth of your shame?" Nefarani swallowed back tears. "It is the depth of my love." Hung between them, heavy with meaning. The pharaoh's gaze darkened. "Then you are a fool," he said, "because love will not save him." And with that, he turned away, his sentence final. At dawn, Kailen would die, and there was nothing left to do but wait for the end. Nefarani refused to accept defeat. Desperation fueled her as she paced her chambers, mind-racing for a way to save Kailen. There was only one choicescape. With Merit's help, she bribed a guard, arranging for the dungeon doors to be left unbolted just before dawn. The plan was simple. Kailen would slip away through the servants' passage, where a horse would be waiting beyond the city walls. When she told him of her plan during their final stolen moment in the dungeon, Kailen's expression was unreadable. "You must come with me," he said, gripping her hand. But Nefarani hesitated. Leaving the palace meant leaving everything she had ever known. It meant abandoning her title, her family, her entire existence. Yet when she looked into Kailen's eyes, she knew none of it mattered without him. "I will," she whispered, sealing her fate. Tomorrow, before the sun could rise, they would flee together, free at last. Or so they believed. The palace was silent. As Nefarani moved through the corridors, her heart hammering in her chest, she reached the dungeon, finding Kailen waiting, just as planned. He clasped her hand, his grip warm and firm. "We run," he whispered. Together, they slipped through the halls like shadows, their footsteps light against the cold stone. The servants' passage lay ahead, their way to freedom. But just as Kailen pushed open the final door, a chorus of shouts shattered the silence. Torches flared in the darkness, revealing a line of Pharaoh's guards blocking their escape. "No," Nefarani breathed, horror gripping her. It was a trap. The Pharaoh had known all along. Before they could react, the guards lunged forward. Kailen shoved Nefarani behind him, fighting back with all the strength he had left. But he was unarmed and weakened from the dungeon's torment. A spear struck him, and his body jerked. "Kailen!" Nefarani screamed as he staggered, his blood staining the ground beneath him. Kailen collapsed into Nefarani's arms, his breath ragged, his blood warm against her hands. "Stay with me," she begged, cradling his face. He smiled weakly, his fingers brushing against her cheek. "I would have chosen you in every life," he whispered. Then his body stilled, his hand slipping from hers. A choked sob tore from Nefarani's throat. She clung to him, rocking back and forth, her grief too heavy to bear. The guards stood motionless, watching the fallen slave, the ruined queen. Then Pharaoh Setep-Ka arrived, his face void of emotion as he looked down at the scene before him. "Take her away," he ordered. "Her punishment will be worse than death." But Nefarani did not hear him. Her world had ended with Kailen's final breath. Nefarani stood at the edge of the desert, the golden sands stretching endlessly before her. She was no longer Queen of Egypt. Her royal garb had been stripped away, leaving her in plain linen, a nameless woman banished from the kingdom she once ruled. The sun burned high in the sky, but she felt nothing. She turned back once, gazing at the towering walls of the palace where she had lived her entire life, where she had loved and lost. Then, with slow, weary steps, she walked forward. The gods had deemed her love a crime, and Pharaoh had cast her aside, but she would carry Kailen's memory with her. Every step she took, every breath she drew, would be in his name. She had lost everything, yet in the depths of her sorrow, she knew one truth she had loved, truly and completely, and for that she had no regrets.